On January 3rd, 2026, while the world was still in the New Year holiday period, the President of the United States was working diligently. He delivered to the world a piece of news that could not have been more shocking. An event without precedent in modern history occurred, sending shockwaves across the globe. The U.S. military launched a large-scale operation in Venezuela, arrested President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and brought them to New York to stand trial. And this happened only a few hours after Mr. Maduro had received a delegation from China. Surely no one could fail to be surprised, except those on the inside in the United States. But why Venezuela and why now? If you look only at what the mainstream media reports, the answer seems simple. Maduro is being prosecuted for narco-terrorism. Since 2020, he allegedly committed election fraud in 2024. He is a dictator, and the United States is merely enforcing justice. But most people around the world do not believe that simple story. The United States has never deployed troops to deal with another country's leader simply because that leader is a dictator. The world has dozens of dictators, dozens of countries reported to be linked to drugs, and dozens of rigged elections. The U.S. does not send troops into all of those places. So what makes Venezuela special? To understand this, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. A picture of a changing world order, of competition among superpowers, and of how a small country can become a critical node in the global network of power. Buried treasure. Let's start with a number, 303 billion barrels. That is the proven oil reserves within Venezuela's territory. And, of course, it is the largest in the world. For comparison, Saudi Arabia has 267 billion barrels, while the United States has only 55 billion barrels. Venezuela has 5.5 times more oil than the U.S. Oil is not just fuel. It is the blood of the modern economy, a weapon of geopolitics, and the lifeline of nations. Countries that control oil are countries with a voice on the world chessboard. And here is the even more important point. For the past half-century, Venezuela's oil once flowed to the United States. American oil companies such as Exxon, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips used to invest billions of dollars there. Venezuela was a reliable supplier for the U.S., right next door. No need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz or contested waters. But then everything changed. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. Yet it was a peaceful nationalization. American companies were compensated and invited to stay as technical partners. Relations remained good. By 1998, things began to turn. Hugo Chavez came to power with the banner of 21st century socialism. He began using oil as a political weapon. In 2007, Chavez seized the assets of foreign oil companies that refused to surrender control. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips were immediately driven out. This was a wound the United States never forgot. Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller called it the largest theft of U.S. assets in history. He declared that the sweat, skill, and labor of Americans had built Venezuela's oil industry. But this is not about money. It is about geopolitical power. Because after losing access to Venezuela's oil, the United States witnessed something even worse. That oil did not disappear. It flowed elsewhere. It flowed to China. How did the dragon end up in the eagle's nest? Here is a striking statistic that few people know. China is now the #1 trading partner of every South American country except Colombia. Over the past 2 decades, while the U.S. was bogged down in wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan, China quietly built influence across Latin America. They built ports, roads, and factories. They provided loans, bought minerals, and imported oil. They did not need to invade. They only needed to write checks with a lot of zeros. Venezuela became the center of that strategy. In 2023, Venezuela and China signed a comprehensive strategic partnership in all circumstances, a designation Beijing grants to only a small number of especially favored countries. 31 agreements were signed, covering cooperation in oil and gas, mining, technology, education, and even space exploration. China became Venezuela's largest oil buyer. Most Venezuelan crude now flows to China at steep discounts. often through covert shipping arrangements designed to evade U.S. sanctions. And it is not only China. In November 2024, Venezuela and Russia signed 17 agreements in defense and energy, including intelligence cooperation, drone operations, military equipment, and oil-related technology. This is no longer the story of a small country. It is the story of the world order. Think of it this way. If Latin America is a chessboard, then Venezuela is a pawn that has crossed the river and is about to be promoted. If that promotion is allowed to happen, the entire position changes. Venezuela becomes a hub, a critical node linking China, Russia, and Iran to the broader region. In the language of network theory, it has high betweenness centrality, a point that many pathways must pass through. Break that node, and the whole network fractures. And that is exactly what is happening. And that is also, coincidentally, precisely what Trump cannot accept. To understand Venezuela, we need to look at the larger confrontation among great powers. The world is undergoing a historic power transition. The post-Cold War unipolar order, with the United States as the sole superpower, is eroding, replaced by a multipolar world with multiple centers of power competing. China is the biggest challenge, the world's second-largest economy, with ambitions to become number one. It is building the Belt and Road Initiative, a network of infrastructure and trade stretching from Asia through Europe and all the way to Latin America. It is creating alternative institutions, such as BRICS, and it is working to build its own payment systems to reduce dependence on the US dollar. In other words, China is trying to build a parallel order alongside the one led by the United States. Russia, though far weaker economically, remains a major military power with the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It openly challenges the US in Ukraine, in Syria, and wherever it can. The key point is that China and Russia are no longer acting separately. They are forming an informal alliance, an axis meant to counterbalance the West. The war in Ukraine has accelerated this process. Russia has been isolated by the West and is forced to rely on China. China, meanwhile, sees Russia as a strategic partner that can help disperse pressure from the United States. This is a classic reinforcing feedback loop. The US applies pressure on Russia and China. That pressure pushes them closer together. Their partnership strengthens. The US feels more threatened and applies even more pressure, and the spiral continues. So where does Venezuela fit into this picture? It is one of the most important nodes in the Russia-China axis in the Western Hemisphere. It supplies oil to China. It serves as a platform for military cooperation with Russia. And it acts as a bridge that helps these two powers reach across Latin America. In systems thinking, there is a concept called a leverage point, a position where a relatively small intervention can produce a large change across the entire system. Venezuela is such a leverage point. That means controlling Venezuela is not only about controlling 303 billion barrels of oil. It is about cutting a critical link in an adversary's influence network. The Pivot to the Hemisphere campaign. To understand why the United States is acting now, we need to look at America's own strategic shift. In 2011, President Obama announced the Pivot to Asia, shifting strategic focus toward Asia to counter China. The idea was to pull back from the Middle East and concentrate resources on the Indo-Pacific. But the pivot to Asia failed. The United States never truly managed to leave the Middle East. ISIS rose, and the US had to return to Iraq and Syria. Then the war in Ukraine erupted, drawing American attention and resources back to Europe. Meanwhile, China waited. It built artificial islands in the South China Sea, expanded militarily, and, most importantly, extended its economic influence into every space the US left unguarded. This is an example of sensitivity to initial conditions in complex systems. A small decision early on can lead to a completely different outcome later. When the US chose to get bogged down in the Middle East instead of concentrating on Asia or Latin America, it left a vacuum. And in international politics, vacuums do not last. Someone fills them. China filled that vacuum. A decade later, the US woke up and realized that China had become the #1 trading partner for nearly all of South America. China had built an influence network right in America's backyard, something the US either did not notice or noticed but dismissed, believing China was still too weak to have that kind of impact. But by the time Donald Trump came onto the scene, the situation seemed different. China was no longer following the old, hide your strength, bide your time approach associated with Deng Xiaoping. Under Xi Jinping, China was rising more openly and assertively with a new strategy. That shift directly created conflict inside the strategic space shared by the United States and China, leading to severe geopolitical friction, most visibly the global trade war during Trump 1.0. And now, with Trump 2.0, the argument is that he has reached a different conclusion from his predecessors. Instead of continuing to chase China in Asia, where China already holds advantages, he chooses to strike where the US can still win and where Russia and China cannot respond quickly, the Western Hemisphere. It is a region where the US has an absolute geographic advantage, where the US military can project power without major obstacles, and where China and Russia cannot intervene directly, even if they wanted to. Trump's 2025 national security strategy places the Western Hemisphere at the very top of the priority list, above Europe, the Middle East, and even the Indo-Pacific. This is the pivot to the hemisphere, a strategic reorientation fundamentally different from Obama's. Instead of chasing your rival on their home turf, you secure your own backyard first. Instead of confronting them head-on in the South China Sea or around Taiwan, where the risk of nuclear escalation is extremely high, you strike at their vulnerabilities in places that are safer for you. Structural disruption. In strategic thinking, there's a concept known as a structural disruption strike. Instead of attacking the main opponent directly, you destroy the pillars, connections, and resources they depend on. Militarily, this is attacking an enemy's rear area and logistics. In the 36 stratagems, tactics like besiege way to rescue Zhao or remove the firewood from under the cauldron are exactly this kind of structural attack. Venezuela becomes a structural disruption move aimed at China and Russia. Think of it as a network. China and Russia are building a counterweight system to the United States, with nodes spread across the world. Venezuela is one of the most important nodes in the Western Hemisphere. When you cut off a critical node, the entire network feels it. If Maduro is removed and replaced by a pro-US government, China loses discounted oil. Russia loses a platform for military cooperation in the Americas. And more importantly, other countries in the region will see the message and understand it. This is the signaling effect in international relations. Action in one place sends a message everywhere else. Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, countries with close ties to Russia and China, would have to rethink their calculations. Countries still weighing which side to lean toward would gain a new factor to consider. This is not direct war with China. It is proxy conflict, peripheral conflict, a war conducted by restructuring the network. And in this kind of warfare, choosing the right target is the key. Venezuela is presented as the perfect target because it concentrates every required factor. It is important enough to impose strategic damage on the opponent. It is vulnerable enough to be defeated quickly. It is morally bad enough to justify action. And there is an available alternative force ready to take over after a takedown. The blow comes from the resonance of multiple strikes. The United States cannot attack a country simply because it sells oil to China. In a complex international system, no single cause is powerful enough to produce an event this large. You need resonance, multiple conditions reinforcing one another. And Venezuela, unfortunately, supplies all of those conditions. Think of it as a system accumulating stress at many different points. Each individual stress point may not be sufficient to trigger collapse, but when they converge, the system crosses a critical threshold. The first pressure point is the loss of legitimacy of the Maduro government. The July 2024 election is described as one of the most blatant frauds in modern history. The opposition reportedly gathered tally sheets from more than 80% of polling stations, showing that candidate Edmundo Gonzalez won with 67% of the vote compared to Maduro's 30%. Yet the Maduro government still declared victory without releasing any supporting evidence. The world saw the fraud, and Maduro lost international legitimacy. The second pressure point is the criminal allegations. Since 2020, Maduro has been indicted in the U.S. District Court in New York on narco-terrorism charges. In November 2025, the Trump administration reportedly declared Maduro the leader of a foreign terrorist organization, placing him in the same category as Al-Qaeda. That created a legal basis, thin but workable, for military action. The third pressure point is internal decline. Venezuela once produced nearly 4 million barrels of oil per day. Now it produces less than 1 million. GDP has fallen by more than 70% over a decade. About 1/4 of the population, roughly 8 million people, has left the country. The military has weakened, and its equipment is outdated. The Maduro regime is portrayed as a building that is hollowed out from the inside, one hard shove away from collapse. The fourth pressure point is the existence of an organized opposition. Gonzalez is recognized by the United States, Europe, and many Latin American countries as the rightful president-elect. Machado has received the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize. If Maduro were removed, there is an internationally recognized alternative ready to take over. When all of these conditions converge, the system crosses a tipping point. In the language of complexity science, this is a phase transition, like water heating gradually, appearing normal until it reaches 100 degrees Celsius and suddenly boils. Venezuela, the argument goes, reached that point. This is perfect resonance. The United States has geopolitical motivation, a legal rationale, a moral justification, and allies inside the country. In a complex system where multiple factors are accumulating pressure, any single factor may not be enough to produce a transformation. But when they converge, the system passes the threshold. And once it crosses, there's no easy way back. Venezuela's political conditions crossed that threshold, creating the opening for the Trump administration to act. But no matter how strong the geopolitical motives are, the United States cannot topple a stable government. Strategy only works when it resonates with the target's internal weaknesses. And Venezuela is presented as a country slowly dying from within. Look at the numbers. In 2000, Venezuela produced more than 3 million barrels of oil per day. By 2020, that figure had fallen to 400,000 barrels. The oil industry, the backbone of the economy, was devastated by poor management, corruption, and lack of investment. In 2007, when Chavez nationalized the oil sector, he expelled foreign experts and replaced them with politically loyal but less capable personnel. The result was that an industry once considered a national pride turned into a wreck. This is a classic example of an archetype in systems thinking. The idea that a short-term solution creates a worse long-term problem. Nationalizing the oil industry helped Chavez control revenue and buy political support in the short run. But it undermined production capacity, contributed to economic collapse, weakened the regime over time, and left it more vulnerable to attack. Inflation at times reached millions of percent. People could no longer afford food or medicine. Hospitals had no electricity. Schools had no teachers. A quarter of the population left the country. The Maduro regime survived not because it had popular support, but because it controlled the military and the repression apparatus. Yet, even the military weakened. Its equipment became obsolete, and there was no money to replace it. Many officers grew dissatisfied because of low pay and the absence of a future. So when the United States attacked, it was not surprising, within this narrative, that the campaign ended in just a few hours. There was no significant resistance. Maduro was captured and taken away, and his government allegedly did not even know where he was. Venezuela's vice president went on television demanding that the United States provide proof of life for Maduro. A strong regime does not collapse like that. Only a regime that has already decayed from within collapses in that way. A lesson from a systems perspective. If we step back and look at this entire event through a systems lens, a clearer picture emerges. The world is moving from a unipolar order to a multipolar one. This is a non-linear process. It does not unfold smoothly and evenly, but through jumps, breaks, and unexpected events. Venezuela is presented as one of those breakpoints. In complex systems, there is no single cause. Every major event is the result of multiple factors reinforcing one another. Venezuela was attacked not only because of oil, not only because of China, not only because of election fraud, and not only because of economic decline, but because all of these factors converged at the same point, creating a window of opportunity that the United States decided to exploit. And in complex systems, consequences are often hard to predict. The United States may have calculated that removing Maduro would weaken China's and Russia's influence network. But the reactions of the parties involved, the reactions of other countries in the region, the reactions of the Venezuelan people, could all produce outcomes that are difficult to foresee. Is this the beginning of a new era in which great powers openly compete for spheres of influence, as in the Cold War? How will China and Russia respond? What lessons will smaller countries draw from Venezuela's fate? These questions have no clear answers yet. The international system is in an unstable state, on the edge of chaos, between an old order that is breaking apart and a new order that has not yet taken shape. And in that kind of environment, events like Venezuela may happen more often. After the Cold War, the world continued to exist under a US-led unipolar order. The United States was the only superpower, the global policeman, the rule setter. Other countries either complied or faced punishment. But that order is eroding. Trump understands this. He believes in the theory of spheres of influence, that great powers have a right to dominate their own geographic regions. The United States has the Western Hemisphere, Russia has its near abroad, and China has East Asia. That is how the world, in his view, should be organized. The problem is that China and Russia do not accept being confined to their own spheres. They reach outward everywhere, even into America's backyard. Venezuela is where these spheres of influence collide, and in that collision, the United States chose to strike first. So what happens next? The most optimistic scenario is that Venezuela transitions peacefully to a democratic government. González and Machado, the internationally recognized opposition leaders, take power. Economic reforms are implemented, international investment returns, and the oil industry is restored. Venezuelans finally get a chance at a better life. A more pessimistic scenario is chaos. Factions fight for power, the military fractures, and violence erupts. Venezuela becomes a failed state, like Libya after Gaddafi. And the most dangerous scenario is escalation. Russia and China do not accept losing Venezuela. They could support resistance forces and supply weapons to destabilize the situation. Conflict could spread to neighboring countries. In the worst case, it could turn into a proxy war between major powers. We are entering an era of uncertainty, where the old world order is dissolving and the new order has not yet formed. And in that vacuum, events like Venezuela will happen more often. Looking at the state of the world like this, I suddenly think of a classic physics book, Forces in Nature by two authors, whose names I don't know how to pronounce, published in the Soviet era. As a child, I loved reading Soviet books because Soviet scientists tended to have deep cultural grounding. Even when they wrote about topics people consider dry, like mathematics and physics, they often quoted poetry to illustrate physical and mathematical principles in a vivid, easy-to-understand way. In the book, the authors present animal survival rules to guide readers toward the concept of force and interaction, affirming that in the material world, objects always act upon one another according to inevitable laws. The falcon fears the eagle. In the river, the crocodile frightens the torpedo fish. When the tiger returns, the wolf bares its teeth. Forever the stronger wins over the weaker. After reading the news, those lines popped into my head. Humans are still living under the control of inevitable laws, and many of them are brutal. We have to face reality. At the international level, the only rule that truly exists is the law of the jungle. Whoever is strongest decides. Looking at today's event, I believe the United States will remain the #1 superpower for many years to come. Delta Force capturing Maduro, plus the intelligence system, operations, and logistics behind it. When will Russia and China ever build something comparable? What if tomorrow Chinese special forces landed in Taipei, seized Lai Ching-te, and brought him back to Beijing to convict him of separatist treason? Or Russian special forces jumped into Kiev, kidnapped Zelensky, and took him to Moscow for trial? I'd sooner believe the martial world has a new grandmaster. But for now, the grandmaster is still Donald Trump. Honestly, who is stronger than him right now? If you enjoyed this piece, please like and share to support us. Don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell icon so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for listening.